Okay, this is part two of our history of the Whitewright Church of Christ. In part one, we did a kind of a survey of the very earliest beginnings, backgrounds, which form the basis of the church here. And now in this part two, we're going to look at what I consider to be kind of the defining moment for the local beginnings of the church here. 1859. I put this in big bright letters because it's a date that I think we ought to kind of be stuck with. It's a very defining moment. B.F. Hall, Benjamin Franklin Hall. It seems like a lot of the people in the early centuries admired Benjamin Franklin, and a lot of them got named by those initials of that name. B.F. Hall conducts an evangelistic meeting at Kentucky Town, 2-3 miles to our west. There were many baptisms, the revival or restoration of other brethren, and so I would think of it as the most significant historical event identifying the corporeal, the earthly origin of our local congregation. The reason I know about this is because I found the following report by Hall. First, he sent it to the Christian Review periodical, and then it was picked up and printed by Alexander Campbell in his Millennial Harbinger publication, or at least by his editors. And I've added some explanatory comments. I put the text of his discourse in colored type so we could distinguish it from my comments. So he starts it off, Halonia, Texas, August 27th, 1859. I think Halonia has to be his own made-up name for his place. It's obviously didn't stick historically in any particular gazetteer that I know anything about. I believe it was located slightly east of today's Whitewright, out near Lindsay Creek. So he begins his report in this way. I yesterday closed a 10 days meeting in my immediate neighborhood. Of course, Kentucky Town is 2-3 miles to the east, to the west of him, but he considers all this his immediate neighborhood, and he said it's the first protracted effort I have made here. We think the events leading up to this meeting, this evangelistic series of meetings, protracted meeting, began in late June or early July. There were some events that happened. And then I think there's a July 16 date that's certain for his response to a tirade. And so then I think his meeting begins on August 16 and goes through the 26th. He says it's the first protracted effort. I feel sure that Hall had previously preached in and around Kentucky Town, maybe at a house church or brethren gathered in one place or another, because there were brethren there, and obviously they would want to make use of someone like B.F. Hall to fill in or supply preach for them. He himself may have been going down quite a bit to Manchway to preach there. He says about the Kentucky Town area, there was once a church here. I don't know if that includes a building or not. Maybe not, but at any rate, he says there was once a church here, but it had long since gone down for the want of regular preaching. There were, however, a few names left, a few who had kept the faith of Jesus and had not denied his name. The neighborhood had long been given up to sin and the lowest, wickedest, meanest sort of sectarianism. That's not a complimentary view of it, but there were some wild folks, I'm sure, active in that area at the time. He uses the word sectarianism. It was used by restorers as the antithesis of our unity goal. That is, people advocating for their denomination instead of advocating for the one church of our Lord. He says the brethren made application for the use of the only meeting house in the neighborhood. Again, it has to be the Kentucky Town Baptist Church because that was the only one there. If there had been a prior building, it no longer existed, but a lot of the early buildings were destroyed by storms or fires. He says, in which for me to deliver a discourse on the subject of union, in answer to one which had been recently delivered there, professedly on the same subject, in which our sentiments were grossly perverted and shamefully misrepresented. So Hall wants to respond to some criticism. Evidently, some preacher had made some critical remarks. Excuse me. We don't know who they were, but according to Chumley's history of the Kentucky Town Baptist Church, the Baptist preachers there around at this time were T.B. McComb, Jesse Portman, and then a visiting speaker by the name of A.G. Moffett. But why had this invective that he wants to answer? How did it come about? What stirred it up? Again, based on the minutes of the Kentucky Town Baptist Church as recorded by Chumley in his book, someone known by the name of Parson Lippman, perhaps, was effective in pressing the restoration plea among the Baptists, so that there have been significant numbers of conversion from the Baptists to the Church of Christ. And that stirred this whole interchange up. The request, that is, a request for the use of their church building, was insultingly refused. A grove near the above house was filled up with seats where I delivered the discourse. So instead of an indoor presentation, the group met under trees. Perhaps there was a brush arbor, which is very common in settlement times. Shortly afterwards, the same man delivered a discourse in answer to mine, in which he wickedly garbled the writings of Brother Campbell, slandered our brethren, and told a falsehood on me. So we've got a real debate going in different venues about matters. He said, I was present, and at the close of the tirade, I published that on a certain day I would review his discourse and disprove the above accusations. So now there's going to be there was a second negative address, which he calls a tirade, which was delivered in response to Hall's outdoor sermon. And then Hall declares he'll respond, and he calls for another assembly. He says this brought together the whole country, and to the entire satisfaction of more than 500 persons present, I more than sustained all my charges. So there's been a lot of interest stirred up over this. This was in the days before football and movies and internet, and this was no doubt a part of this whole interest thing. But Hall speaks on an appointed day, and he says, well, I did so convincingly. He said, this gave me an opportunity of spreading before the people our real sentiments, and a month from that day we commenced our protracted effort. So Hall, after a month, begins a series of meetings. He says, we unfurled the banner of the Lone Star, the Star of Bethlehem, ran it up to the top of the flagstaff, and nailed it there. A few faithful soldiers rallied around it. For the first time in Texas, we preached controversially. We carried the war into Africa. Well, he seems to think of Texas as populated with some type of primitive heathen or something, some such. I don't know about his other imagery. Don't know where it comes from. Nearly a whole week we preached twice a day in the open air to fine audiences with but little effect, save that we convinced many that we were right and had the truth. Some of the brethren became discouraged and proposed that we close the meeting. So after a week or thereabouts, he had no responses, and so some said, well, we're not going to get anywhere. Whilst so many came and heard with so much interest, we resolved to preach on, and at length a breach was made. The ranks commenced giving way. 4, I think, surrendered together, and gave in their allegiance to Prince Messiah. After that, they fell wounded at every fire. So the effort continued on. He uses some battle imagery here. 4 people were baptized initially, and then he says at every service there were responses. We closed yesterday with just 50 additions to the army of the faithful, 31 by confession and so forth, 19 reclaimed. We reorganized the church, which now consists of some 70 or more members. I don't know why he says just 50. That sounds like a significant number, maybe a difference in the definition of just. He says, nearly all my neighbors, I put the underlines in here, heads of families and the young, became obedient to the faith. Never, under my observation, has truth more gloriously triumphed. Our section is now completely revolutionized. There is great joy and gladness in our neighborhood. Our congregations were large to the last, and we closed only because I was worn out. And so he says the whole section was revolutionized. I don't think he's necessarily exaggerating. I think for 3 or 4 decades, the Church of Christ was pretty much dominant in this area. Didn't stay that way. He says yesterday a subscription was circulated and almost enough was subscribed at once to build a church house. We hope to have up a good frame house and to be in it before winter. At my last meeting in McKinney, save one, 12 noble souls became obedient to the faith. Yours in the faith, B.F. Hall. So, via Mantua, where Hall had done preaching, and then having his location near present-day Whitewright, just to the east of Kentucky Town, because of the McKinney's church and because of Hall, the Whitewright congregation has its roots and connections with the earliest Church of Christ settlements in Texas. In our ensuing history, we're going to look at a little bit more about the Kentucky Town Church, what we know of it, and then we're going to look at the Whitewright Church. So the 1859 date up to 1878 is when the church was present in Kentucky Town. We don't have a lot of history. We are very fortunate to have the book by Joe Chumley, Kentucky Town and its Baptist Church, which he based a lot on the minutes of the Kentucky Town Baptist Church, and we're very indebted to him, and it's an excellent work. But Chumley refers to the Reformers at one point in his book, but he doesn't recognize it as a reference to the Church of Christ, but we are sure that it was. During this period, the American Civil War takes place, 1861 to 67, and Hall was largely not in our area in Texas during this period. He actually went and fought in the war, helped fight in the war, but then he's back in the Kentucky Town area, the Whitewright area, about 1869, at least by then. In 1873, he passes away, still in this vicinity. He's buried, I believe, over at Van Alstyne. And then again, his wife dies again in this same vicinity in 1878. What about church buildings in Kentucky Town? Well, again, we don't know a whole lot. According to Chumley, in the Baptist, as he derived information from the Baptist minutes, in 1854 there were 4 organized churches, including the Church of Christ, but we don't, whether he meant they had houses of worship, each one or not, is unclear. In 1858, we know the brethren had asked to use the Baptist building, so that would indicate at this time they did not have a building. And then in 1862, following this major date of 1859, the brethren do have a building, and the Baptists request to use their building. Then sometime between 1865 into the 1870s, that building that they had at that time somehow was destroyed. In 1874, the German family converts a former schoolhouse into use for the church. And then in 1878, that building is moved physically from Kentucky Town to Whitewright. Well, we just made note that the James German family converted the Pleasant Grove School into a church house for the Church of Christ there in Kentucky Town. And again, as it was in many cases, this was a shared community type of building. They were not selfish with their facilities normally. Well, that's the end of part two. In part three, we'll begin the Whitewright phase of our history, and I'm hoping that you finding this of interest, and I appreciate your watching our presentation. Thank you.